The waitress fed the homeless man. She was shocked to discover who he was. Hello, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and comment on what you think will happen. And let's see if you manage to guess right. Write your prediction below, and at the end, I'll give you the answer. The early morning light filtered through the windows of the small, cozy diner where Lily worked. It was her daily routine: arrive before the sun fully rose, clean the tables, and get everything ready for the breakfast rush. She didn't mind the routine, even finding a strange comfort in the predictability of her day. The bell above the door chimed softly as the first few regulars began to trickle in, offering friendly greetings and smiles. Lily's smile never faltered, despite the exhaustion that clung to her bones. She was good at her job, known for her kindness and attentiveness, always making sure every customer felt at home. But this morning, something felt different, something she couldn't quite put her finger on. As she moved between the tables, wiping them down and refilling coffee cups, Lily noticed him. He had slipped in quietly, almost unnoticed, and sat at the farthest table in the corner, close to the window. His clothes were tattered, a clear sign that life had not been kind to him. His face was unshaven, and his eyes held the weight of someone who had seen too much, carried too much. She hesitated for a moment, unsure if she should approach, but the sight of him sitting there, staring at the empty plate in front of him, tugged at something deep within her. Lily had always been soft-hearted, and she couldn't bear to see anyone go hungry. Without a second thought, she grabbed a menu and walked over to him. "Good morning," she said softly, offering him the menu with a smile. His eyes flickered up to meet hers, and for a brief moment, something unspoken passed between them, an acknowledgement of sorts. He didn't take the menu, simply shaking his head. "I don't have any money," he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. Lily paused, her heart aching at his admission. She had seen many people down on their luck, especially in the area the diner was located, but there was something different about this man. She couldn't place it, but it gnawed at her as she stood there. "Don't worry about it," she replied, her voice gentle and reassuring. "Let me get you something to eat. It's on me." She returned to the kitchen, preparing a simple meal: scrambled eggs, toast, and a cup of hot coffee. As she worked, her mind wandered, wondering what had brought him to this point. What was his story? She had seen many people come and go in the diner, each with their own struggles, but this man intrigued her in a way she didn't understand. When she returned to his table, placing the plate in front of him, his hands trembled slightly as he picked up the fork. He glanced up at her again, his lips parting as if he wanted to say something, but no words came. Instead, he simply nodded, a silent thank you. Lily watched him for a moment before returning to her duties, her thoughts lingering on the stranger in the corner. The hours ticked by slowly as Lily continued her work, but her thoughts kept drifting back to the man in the corner. He had finished his meal quietly, taking small bites as if savoring every bit, but there was a heaviness in his demeanor that she couldn't shake. As the lunch crowd began to pour in, she glanced over at his table and saw that he hadn't moved. His eyes were focused on something outside the window, far away, as if lost in a distant memory. She debated whether to approach him again, unsure if he wanted to be left alone. But her curiosity got the best of her. She walked over, refilling his coffee cup and offering him a warm smile. "Can I get you anything else?" she asked, her voice soft and kind. He blinked, pulling himself out of his thoughts and glancing up at her. For a moment he said nothing, and she wondered if she had overstepped. But then, to her surprise, he spoke. "Why are you being so kind to me?" His question caught her off guard. It wasn't asked in anger or suspicion, but rather with genuine confusion. Lily hesitated, unsure of how to respond. "It's just, I don't like seeing anyone go hungry," she replied honestly. "Everyone deserves a little kindness." He stared at her for a long moment, his eyes searching hers as if trying to understand her motives. "I wasn't always like this, you know," he said suddenly, his voice quiet but steady. Lily tilted her head, intrigued by the shift in the conversation. "I had a life once, everything I could ever want. But things changed." His gaze drifted back to the window, his expression unreadable. Lily felt a pang of empathy for him, sensing the weight of his words. She wanted to ask more, to understand what had happened to him, but she knew it wasn't her place to pry. Instead, she simply nodded, allowing the silence to stretch between them. Sometimes, she had learned, silence could speak louder than words. Just as she was about to walk away, he spoke again. "I've been looking for something or someone," he said softly, almost as if talking to himself. Lily's heart skipped a beat. There was something haunting in his tone, something that hinted at a deeper story. She opened her mouth to ask him what he meant, but before she could, the door to the diner swung open, and a group of customers walked in, distracting her. She gave him one last look, her mind racing with questions, before turning her attention to the new arrivals. As she seated them and took their orders, she couldn't help but glance back at the man in the corner, wondering what his story was, and why it mattered so much to her. By the time the lunch rush had died down and the diner was quiet again, Lily noticed that the man was gone. His plate and cup were neatly placed at the edge of the table, and there was no trace of him, except for the lingering feeling he had left behind. She frowned, realizing she hadn't even asked his name. There was something about him that tugged at her, something that made her want to know more. But as she cleaned up the table, she found herself questioning why she cared so much. He was just another customer, after all, or was he? The next day, Lily arrived at the diner with the same routine, but her mind was far from the task at hand. She couldn't stop thinking about the man from the previous day. Who was he looking for? Why had his words stayed with her so strongly? As the day passed, she found herself glancing at the door every time the bell chimed, half expecting him to walk in again. But he didn't. Hours went by, and the diner began to fill up with the usual faces. Still, there was no sign of him. It was silly, she thought, to be so concerned about a stranger. Yet, something about him had shaken her, and she couldn't shake the feeling that their encounter was far from over. Later that afternoon, just as she was about to clock out, she noticed something tucked beneath one of the salt shakers on the table where the man had sat the day before. Her heart skipped a beat as she approached the table and saw a folded piece of paper. She glanced around to see if anyone had noticed it before carefully picking it up. The paper felt oddly heavy in her hand, as if it carried more weight than just words. Unfolding it slowly, she saw a handwritten note inside. The handwriting was shaky but legible. "Thank you for your kindness. You have no idea what it means. I'll repay it one day." Beneath the note was a name, Daniel. The name seemed to strike a chord deep within her, but she couldn't quite place why. She stood there, staring at the note, her mind racing. Daniel, was that his name? And why had he left her this cryptic message? A strange feeling of unease settled over her. It wasn't fear exactly, but rather the sense that something much larger than she could comprehend was unfolding. She folded the note back up and slipped it into her apron pocket, deciding to keep it for now. As she walked to the back of the diner to collect her things, she couldn't help but wonder what he had meant by repaying her kindness. The words lingered in her mind like a promise, or perhaps a warning. That evening, as she walked home through the dimly lit streets, the note continued to weigh on her thoughts. The city felt different tonight, colder, quieter, as if the air itself was holding its breath. She quickened her pace, eager to reach the safety of her small apartment. But as she rounded the corner to her building, she froze. Standing in the shadows near the entrance was a figure, a man. Her heart raced as her eyes tried to adjust to the darkness. For a brief moment, she thought it was Daniel, come to repay whatever debt he felt he owed. But as the man stepped forward into the dim streetlight, she realized with a jolt that it wasn't him. It was someone else, someone she didn't recognize, but the look in his eyes sent a chill down her spine. He was watching her, his expression unreadable. Lily's breath caught in her throat, and for a split second, she considered turning around and walking the other way. But before she could make a move, the man spoke. "You should be careful who you're kind to," he said, his voice low and rough. "Not everyone deserves it." The words echoed in the empty street as he turned and walked away, leaving Lily standing there, her heart pounding in her chest. What had he meant by that? And how did he know about Daniel? Lily spent the night tossing and turning, her mind consumed by the strange encounter and the ominous words from the man outside her building. "You should be careful who you're kind to," he had said, his voice still echoing in her ears. Who was he? And how did he know about Daniel? The questions circled endlessly in her thoughts, leaving her restless. When the sun finally rose, she felt no closer to understanding the mystery that was unfolding around her. Determined to get some answers, she grabbed the note Daniel had left and slipped it into her bag before heading out to the diner. The day passed in a blur of coffee orders and plates of food, but Lily's mind was elsewhere. She couldn't focus, couldn't shake the feeling that she was missing something important. Every time the bell above the door chimed, she found herself looking up, half expecting Daniel to walk through the door again. But just like the day before, he didn't show. As the afternoon lull settled over the diner, Lily decided she couldn't wait any longer. She needed to find out who Daniel was and why he had seemed so familiar to her. Taking a deep breath, she approached the counter where her coworker, Jen, was refilling the sugar jars. "Hey, Jen," Lily began, trying to sound casual. "Do you remember the guy who was sitting in the corner the other day? The one I gave the free meal to?" Jen glanced up, a curious expression on her face. "Yeah, I remember. Why? Did something happen?" Lily hesitated, unsure of how much to share. "I found a note he left," she said, pulling the folded paper out of her apron and handing it to Jen. Jen unfolded it and read the message, her eyebrows knitting together in confusion. "Daniel," she murmured. "That name sounds familiar." Lily's heart skipped a beat. "It does?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jen nodded slowly, her eyes narrowing in thought. "I think I've heard that name before," Jen said, her voice trailing off. "But I can't remember where. It's on the tip of my tongue." She handed the note back to Lily, who stared at it for a long moment. There was something there, some connection that was just out of reach. "I need to figure this out," Lily muttered to herself, feeling more determined than ever. She folded the note and tucked it back into her pocket, her mind racing with possibilities. Maybe there was more to this man than she realized. Maybe he wasn't just another person down on his luck. But why would someone leave such a cryptic message? And what had the other man meant about being careful? Later that evening, as Lily left the diner and made her way home, the city seemed eerily quiet again, just like the night before. Her footsteps echoed in the empty streets, and she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. Her mind kept going back to the name Daniel, and the strange sense that she had heard it somewhere before. As she reached her apartment building, she paused, her hand on the door handle. A thought had crossed her mind, a vague memory from years ago, a news story that had briefly caught her attention but had been forgotten as quickly as it had come. It was about a man named Daniel, but he wasn't just anyone. He had been someone important, someone powerful. But the details were hazy, and Lily couldn't quite piece it together. She pushed open the door and made her way inside, her heart racing with the thrill of discovery. What if Daniel was that man? The man from the story? Her fingers trembled as she pulled out her phone and started searching online, typing in Daniel and missing. As the search results began to load, one headline caught her eye. "Billionaire heir disappears after tragic accident." Lily's breath caught in her throat. Could it be him? Could the homeless man she had fed really be Daniel, the heir to a fortune? The man who had vanished without a trace years ago. Lily's hands trembled as she clicked on the article, her heart racing with a mixture of disbelief and anticipation. The headline glared back at her, almost mocking her for not seeing the signs sooner. "Billionaire heir disappears after tragic accident." She read the details carefully, her mind struggling to reconcile the image of the homeless man she had met with the man described in the article. Daniel Remington, the sole heir to the Remington family fortune, had vanished without a trace after a fatal car accident claimed the lives of his parents nearly 5 years ago. The media had speculated that he had gone into hiding, unable to cope with the loss and the pressure of his newfound responsibilities. Lily's heart pounded in her chest as the pieces of the puzzle slowly started to fit together. Could the man she had fed in the diner really be Daniel Remington? It seemed impossible, yet the more she thought about it, the more it made sense. His disheveled appearance, the haunted look in his eyes, and the cryptic note he had left. It all pointed to something deeper, something more than just a man down on his luck. But if it was true, why had he been living like this? And why had he chosen her diner, of all places, to leave his message? The questions swirled in her mind as she continued to read, her eyes scanning the article for any more clues. There were reports of sightings over the years, but none had ever been confirmed. Some people believed he had died, while others thought he was living under a new identity. But none of the reports mentioned him being homeless. Lily couldn't help but wonder what had happened to him after the accident. What could drive a man with everything to live on the streets, unnoticed and forgotten? She closed the article and leaned back in her chair, her mind racing. She knew she had to find him, had to talk to him again. She needed to know the truth. The next morning, Lily arrived at the diner earlier than usual, her mind still reeling from the discovery. The day dragged on, with each passing hour only heightening her sense of urgency. She glanced at the door every few minutes, hoping Daniel would walk through it again. But by the time the lunch rush had ended, there was still no sign of him. Frustration and worry gnawed at her. What if he never came back? What if she never got the chance to confront him and ask him who he really was? She couldn't let it go. She had to find him somehow. As the afternoon wore on, a sense of determination settled over her. If Daniel wasn't going to come to her, then she would have to find him herself. After her shift ended, she decided to retrace her steps from the previous night. Maybe he was still out there, somewhere on the streets, lost in the shadows. She grabbed her coat and set off into the city, her heart pounding with anticipation. The streets felt colder and darker than usual, but Lily didn't care. She needed answers. She wandered for hours, searching alleyways and park benches, asking anyone she passed if they had seen a man matching Daniel's description. Most people shook their heads, offering her nothing but empty stares. Just as she was about to give up, she spotted a familiar figure huddled against the side of a building, his back to her. Her heart leapt into her throat as she approached, her footsteps slow and deliberate. "Daniel," she called softly, her voice barely above a whisper. The man flinched at the sound of his name, but he didn't turn around. Lily's breath caught in her chest as she took another step closer. "Is it really you?" she asked, her voice trembling with emotion. For a long moment, there was only silence. And then, slowly, the man turned to face her. It was him. The world seemed to stand still as Lily and Daniel locked eyes. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the weight of unspoken words hanging heavy in the cold night air. Daniel looked different from how he had appeared in the diner. He looked even more fragile now, as though the burden of his past had crushed him further in the time since she last saw him. His face was gaunt, and his clothes clung to him like tattered remnants of a life once lived. But despite his appearance, it was unmistakably him, the same man she had shown kindness to only days ago. And now, as she stood before him, the questions that had plagued her mind boiled over, desperate for answers. "Why didn't you tell me?" Lily asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Daniel's eyes dropped to the ground, and he shook his head slowly. "Because it doesn't matter anymore," he murmured, his voice hoarse. "That life is gone. I'm not that person anymore." Lily took a step closer, her heart aching at the pain in his voice. "But you are," she insisted, her voice firm yet gentle. "You're Daniel Remington. You had everything. People are still looking for you. Your name is in the news. How can you just give up like this?" She could see the conflict in his eyes as he lifted his gaze to meet hers. "It's not that simple," he said softly. "When my parents died, I couldn't handle it. The pressure, the expectations. Everyone looking to me to fill their shoes, to carry on the legacy. I wasn't ready. I never was. So I ran. I thought I could escape it all, leave behind the guilt, the grief, the responsibility. But it just followed me." He paused, his expression twisting in anguish. "I've been running ever since, but no matter where I go, I can't outrun what happened that night." Lily's heart broke for him as she listened to his story. She could hear the years of pain in his words, feel the weight of his sorrow. "But hiding won't change anything," Lily said gently, stepping closer. "You can't keep running forever. You don't have to live like this." Daniel shook his head again, a bitter smile playing on his lips. "I don't deserve anything else," he muttered. "I've let everyone down. I let my parents down, I let myself down. Maybe this is what I deserve." Lily reached out, placing a hand on his arm. "You don't have to punish yourself like this," she said, her voice filled with compassion. "You're not alone. There are people who care about you, people who still believe in you. You can start over." For the first time since their encounter, Daniel looked at her with something like hope flickering in his eyes, though it was faint. He seemed to be grappling with her words, struggling to believe them. "Why are you being so kind to me?" he asked, echoing the question he had asked when they first met. Lily smiled softly, her hand still resting on his arm. "Because everyone deserves a second chance," she said simply. "And I believe you can find your way back." Daniel stared at her for a long moment, his eyes searching hers, as if trying to understand why she cared so much. But before he could respond, a noise in the distance startled them both, breaking the moment. Lily glanced over her shoulder and saw a figure approaching from the shadows. Her heart leapt into her throat as she recognized the man who had confronted her outside her apartment the night before. He stepped forward, his expression cold and menacing. "I told you to be careful who you're kind to," he said, his voice low and dangerous. Lily instinctively moved closer to Daniel, her body tense with fear. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice steady despite the fear clawing at her. The man's eyes flicked between her and Daniel, a cruel smile twisting his lips. "This isn't over," he said darkly, before turning and disappearing into the night. Lily's heart raced as she turned back to Daniel, fear gripping her chest. "Who was that?" she asked, her voice trembling. But Daniel's expression had changed. The hope that had briefly flickered in his eyes was gone, replaced by a look of dread. "You need to stay away from me," he said urgently, stepping back. "It's not safe." Before Lily could protest, he turned and ran, disappearing into the darkness, leaving her standing there, shaken and alone. Lily stood frozen in the darkened street, her heart pounding as she watched Daniel disappear into the shadows. The man's words still echoed in her mind, sharp and unsettling. "This isn't over." A chill ran down her spine, and she felt more vulnerable than ever before. What had she gotten herself into? And why was Daniel so determined to push her away? She knew she should leave, walk away from this mess before it consumed her. But something inside her refused to let go. She couldn't leave Daniel to fend for himself, not after everything he had been through. There was more to this story, and Lily was determined to uncover the truth, even if it meant putting herself in danger. The next day at the diner, Lily found it hard to focus. She replayed the events of the night before over and over in her mind, trying to piece together the puzzle. Who was that man, and why was he following Daniel? There was a darkness surrounding him, a danger that felt all too real. But Daniel had looked terrified, and she couldn't shake the feeling that he was in over his head. As the hours dragged on, Lily made a decision. She couldn't sit by and do nothing. She needed to find Daniel before it was too late. She didn't know exactly where to start, but she knew she had to try. After her shift ended, Lily began her search. She walked the same streets as the night before, looking for any sign of Daniel. The city was alive with the usual hustle and bustle, but there was an undercurrent of tension that made her uneasy. She asked a few people if they had seen him, describing his appearance as best as she could, but no one seemed to know anything. It was as if he had vanished. Hours passed, and just as Lily was about to give up, she spotted a figure huddled in an alleyway, partially hidden behind a stack of old boxes. Her heart skipped a beat as she recognized the familiar silhouette. "Daniel," she called softly, approaching cautiously. The figure shifted, and as she got closer, she saw that it was indeed him. His face was pale, and he looked even more worn down than before. "What are you doing here?" she asked gently, kneeling beside him. "You shouldn't be out here alone." Daniel's eyes flicked up to meet hers, and for a moment, she saw the same vulnerability that had drawn her to him in the first place. But then his gaze hardened. "You need to leave," he said firmly, his voice filled with urgency. "I told you it's not safe." Lily frowned, refusing to back down. "I'm not leaving you," she said, her voice steady. "Not until you tell me what's going on. Why is that man after you? What did he mean when he said this isn't over?" Daniel's jaw tightened, and he looked away, his hands trembling slightly. "It's complicated," he muttered. "I've made some bad decisions. Got involved with the wrong people after everything happened." He paused, his voice catching. "Now they won't leave me alone." They think I owe them something, but I can't give them what they want. Lily's heart ached as she listened to his confession. He was trapped, caught between his past and the dangerous people who had taken advantage of his grief. "Then let me help you," she said, her voice soft but determined. "You don't have to go through this alone." Daniel shook his head, his expression pained. "You don't understand," he whispered. "They'll come after you too if you get involved. You need to walk away before it's too late." But Lily wasn't willing to walk away. She couldn't. "I'm not afraid," she said firmly, surprising even herself with the strength in her voice. "I don't care who they are. We can figure this out together. There has to be a way to make this right." Before Daniel could respond, the sound of footsteps echoed down the alley, and Lily's blood ran cold. She turned to see the same man from the previous night, his cold eyes locking onto hers with a look of satisfaction. "I warned you," he said, his voice dripping with menace. "But it looks like you didn't listen." Panic surged through Lily as the man stepped closer, his hand sliding into his coat pocket. "Now you've made it worse," he sneered. "For both of you." Daniel jumped to his feet, stepping protectively in front of Lily. "Leave her out of this," he growled, his voice filled with desperation. The man smirked, shaking his head slowly. "Too late for that," he said. "You should have stayed hidden, Daniel. Now it's time to pay." Lily's heart raced as the man stepped closer, his eyes filled with a cold, calculated menace. The tension in the alleyway was suffocating, the air thick with danger. Daniel stood in front of her, his body tense and ready to act, but Lily could see the fear in his eyes. This man wasn't bluffing, he was serious, and the stakes were higher than she could have ever imagined. She swallowed hard, trying to steady her breath, but the reality of the situation crashed over her like a wave. She had been pulled into something far darker than she had anticipated, and now there was no turning back. The man smirked, clearly enjoying the fear he was instilling in both of them. "You've been running for a long time, Daniel," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "But you can't hide forever. We always collect what's owed to us." Lily's mind raced as she tried to make sense of his words. What could Daniel possibly owe this man? What kind of trouble had he gotten into? She glanced at Daniel, hoping for some kind of explanation, but his jaw was clenched, his fists balled tightly at his sides. He was holding something back, something he hadn't told her. "What do you want?" Daniel asked, his voice hardening as he faced the man. There was a fire in his eyes now, a determination that hadn't been there before. "I told you, I have nothing left to give. You've taken everything." The man's smirk widened as he pulled a folded piece of paper from his coat pocket and held it up for Daniel to see. "Oh, but that's where you're wrong," he said. "There's still one thing you can give us, your legacy. The fortune your family left behind. You think you can just disappear and leave it all behind? Not a chance. We want what's rightfully ours." Lily's heart sank as the truth hit her like a punch to the gut. This was about money, Daniel's inheritance. The life he had tried to escape was still haunting him, and now it had found him once again. The man in front of them wasn't just some thug. He was part of something much bigger, something that had been lurking in the shadows ever since Daniel had gone into hiding. She could see the anguish in Daniel's face as he realized there was no escaping it this time. "You can't have it," Daniel said through gritted teeth. "It's gone. I gave it all away." The man's eyes darkened, his smirk fading into something much more dangerous. "You think we're playing games here?" he hissed. "You don't get to decide that. We'll take what's ours, one way or another." He took a step closer, and Lily instinctively reached for Daniel's arm, her pulse racing. She didn't know what to do, but she knew she couldn't let this happen. "There has to be another way," she blurted out, her voice trembling but resolute. The man's cold eyes flicked to hers, and for a moment, she thought she saw a flicker of amusement. "You're brave," he said, his voice mocking. "But this isn't your fight." Lily's grip on Daniel tightened as she stepped forward, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her veins. "I don't care if it's my fight or not," she said. "You can't just take everything from him. He's already lost so much." The man raised an eyebrow, his gaze shifting between her and Daniel. "You really don't get it, do you?" he said with a dark chuckle. "This isn't about what's fair. It's about power, control. And right now we hold all the cards. He unfolded the paper in his hand and held it out to Daniel, his eyes gleaming with victory. "Sign this, and it'll all be over." Daniel stared at the paper, his expression unreadable. Lily could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on them. If he signed it, he would be giving up everything, the last connection to his family, the life he had run from, and perhaps even his future. But if he didn't, they would never stop coming after him. She could see the conflict in his eyes, the war raging within him as he tried to decide what to do. "Don't do it," she whispered, her voice urgent. "There has to be another way." For a long moment, Daniel didn't move. The man watched him with a predator's patience, waiting for him to break. And then slowly, Daniel reached out and took the paper. Lily's heart sank as she watched him unfold it, his hands trembling. He was about to sign away everything, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. But just as he lifted the pen, something changed. Daniel's expression hardened, and he threw the paper to the ground, his voice ringing out with defiance. "No," he said firmly. "You won't take what's left of me." The man's face darkened with fury, and for a split second, Lily thought he might lash out. But instead he smiled, a cold, terrifying smile that sent chills down her spine. "You've just made the biggest mistake of your life," he said quietly. "This isn't over." And with that, he turned and disappeared into the shadows, leaving Lily and Daniel standing in the alley, their hearts pounding with the weight of what had just happened. The silence in the alley after the man disappeared was deafening. Lily's breath came in shallow gasps as she stared at the spot where he had stood just moments ago, his final words still echoing in her mind. "This isn't over." A chill ran down her spine, and she turned to Daniel, who stood rigid, his fists clenched at his sides. His face was pale, his eyes filled with a storm of emotions, anger, fear, and something else she couldn't quite place. She wanted to say something, anything, to break the tension, but the words caught in her throat. Instead, she reached out and touched his arm gently, grounding him in the moment. Daniel flinched at her touch, but didn't pull away. For a moment, they stood in the dim alley, the weight of everything that had just happened pressing down on them both. "Are you okay?" Lily asked softly, her voice barely above a whisper. Daniel closed his eyes and exhaled shakily, trying to regain his composure. "I don't know," he admitted, his voice raw. "I don't know what to do anymore." Lily's heart ached for him, and she could feel the desperation in his words. He had been running for so long, carrying the burden of his past alone, and now it seemed like it was all crashing down around him. "You don't have to face this alone," she said gently, her hand still resting on his arm. "We can figure this out together. There has to be a way to make things right." Daniel shook his head, his expression pained. "You don't understand," he said, his voice tight. "They won't stop. They'll keep coming after me until they get what they want. And now you're involved too." His eyes met hers, filled with regret. "I should never have come back. I should have stayed hidden." Lily's heart twisted at his words. She could see the guilt eating away at him, the weight of his decisions crushing him. "You didn't have a choice," she said, her voice firm. "You can't keep running forever, Daniel. This isn't your fault." But even as she said the words, she knew they offered little comfort. The situation was far more complicated than either of them had anticipated, and the danger was real. The man's threats weren't empty. He had the power to ruin everything, and they both knew it. But Lily refused to believe that all hope was lost. There had to be a way to fight back, to reclaim Daniel's life and protect him from the shadows that were closing in around him. As they walked back through the city streets, the weight of the encounter still hung heavy in the air. The city's lights flickered around them, casting long shadows that seemed to follow their every step. Lily could feel the tension in Daniel's body, the exhaustion seeping into every movement. He was a man on the edge, and she wasn't sure how much longer he could hold on. But she knew one thing: she wasn't going to let him face this alone. "We need to figure out who that man was," Lily said after a long silence. "If we can understand what they want and why they're after you, maybe we can find a way to stop them." Daniel's eyes flickered with a mixture of hope and fear. "You don't know these people," he said, his voice low. "They don't just stop. They have connections, power. More than I ever had." He paused, his jaw tightening. "They don't care about the money itself. They care about control. The Remington name still holds influence, and as long as I'm alive, I'm a threat to them. They want me gone, one way or another. Lily's stomach twisted at his words, the reality of the situation sinking in deeper. This wasn't just about money. It was about erasing Daniel from existence, wiping away the last trace of his family's legacy. But Lily wasn't ready to give up. There has to be something we can do, she insisted, her voice filled with determination. Maybe we can go to the police, or find someone who can help. Daniel's expression darkened, and he shook his head. The police won't help, he said bitterly. They're in too deep with people like him. Trust me, I've tried before. There's no one we can trust. His words hung in the air like a heavy fog, and for the first time, Lily felt a flicker of doubt. Could they really fight back against something so powerful? Was there any way to win? But before she could spiral further into her thoughts, Daniel stopped suddenly, his gaze hardening. There's one person who might be able to help, he said, his voice barely audible. Lily turned to him, hope flickering in her chest. Who? She asked urgently. Daniel hesitated for a moment, his eyes filled with uncertainty. An old family friend, he said finally. He was close to my parents, before everything fell apart. If anyone knows how to get us out of this, it's him. Lily's pulse quickened. This was the first real glimmer of hope they had found, and she wasn't about to let it slip away. Then we need to find him, she said, her voice filled with resolve. Daniel nodded slowly, his expression distant. I just hope we're not too late. The morning air was crisp and filled with the scent of damp earth as Lily and Daniel made their way through the quieter part of the city. Daniel had told her little about the person they were going to see, only that he was an old friend of his family and someone he believed could help. The tension between them was palpable, each step weighed down by the uncertainty of what lay ahead. The streets were eerily quiet, as though the city itself was holding its breath. Lily couldn't help but feel a mix of apprehension and hope. Could this really be the turning point they needed, or were they walking into yet another dead end? As they approached the outskirts of the city, Daniel grew more withdrawn, his silence thick with unspoken fears. Lily glanced at him, wondering what was running through his mind. Are you sure about this? She asked, her voice soft. Daniel hesitated for a moment before nodding. I don't know if we can trust him, he admitted, his eyes scanning the streets as if expecting to see someone lurking in the shadows. But he's the only one left who might still be on my side. Lily's heart sank at the thought. Daniel had been so alone for so long, and now they were putting all their faith in a man he hadn't seen in years. It was a gamble, but it was the only lead they had. They finally arrived at a modest house on the edge of the city, its paint peeling and the yard overgrown. It didn't look like much, but Daniel assured her this was the place. He knocked on the door, the sound echoing in the quiet morning. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. Then, slowly, the door creaked open, revealing an older man with silver hair and sharp, calculating eyes. He studied Daniel for a long moment, his gaze intense, before his face softened with recognition. Daniel, the man said, his voice gruff but warm. I thought I'd never see you again. The man's name was Thomas, and from the way Daniel spoke to him, it was clear they had a complicated history. Thomas invited them inside, leading them into a cluttered living room filled with old photographs and books. Lily stayed close to Daniel, unsure of what to expect. Thomas motioned for them to sit, his eyes flicking between the two of them. I know why you're here, he said bluntly, settling into a worn armchair. You're in trouble, and it's worse than you think. Daniel tensed, his hands gripping the edge of his chair. You know about them? He asked, his voice tight. Thomas nodded slowly, his expression grim. I've been keeping an eye on things since your parents died, he said. I knew they wouldn't leave you alone. They've been circling, waiting for the right moment to strike. He leaned forward, his gaze piercing. But now they've made their move, and they won't stop until they get what they want. Lily felt a cold knot form in her stomach. This was worse than she had imagined. Is there anything we can do? She asked, her voice trembling slightly. Thomas glanced at her, his expression softening for a moment. There's always a way, he said, his tone more gentle. But it won't be easy. He turned back to Daniel, his face serious. The people you're dealing with, they don't just want your money or your name. They want to control everything your family built. They've been planning this for years, slowly undermining everything from the inside. They won't stop until they've taken it all. Daniel's face hardened, and Lily could see the determination in his eyes. Then we fight back, Daniel said firmly. I'm done running. Thomas nodded, a flicker of approval in his gaze. Good, he said, because running won't save you now. We'll need to be smart about this. Hit them where it hurts. As they talked strategy, Lily felt a strange mixture of hope and dread. There was a plan forming, a path forward, but the risks were enormous. These people had resources, connections, and power that she and Daniel could barely comprehend. But for the first time since this nightmare had begun, there was a sense of purpose, a chance to take control of their fate. Thomas laid out the details of what they needed to do. Expose the corruption within the organization that was after Daniel, gather evidence, and turn the tables on them. It would take time and precision, but it was possible. You'll need to be careful, Thomas warned. One wrong move, and it could all fall apart. As they left Thomas's house later that afternoon, Lily felt a strange sense of calm. It wasn't over yet, but for the first time, she believed there might be a way out of this. Daniel walked beside her, his expression focused and determined. They had a plan now, a real chance to fight back. But the road ahead was dangerous, and the people after them wouldn't go down without a fight. Still, as they walked back into the heart of the city, Lily couldn't help but feel that they had just taken the first step toward reclaiming their lives. Days passed, each one more tense than the last as Lily and Daniel began to put Thomas's plan into action. The first step was gathering information, and that meant diving deep into the network of people who had been hunting Daniel. Thomas had given them the names of several key figures, people who were once loyal to the Remington family, but had now aligned themselves with the enemy. Lily felt a growing sense of danger as she and Daniel navigated through the city, seeking out these individuals in the hopes of uncovering the truth. The stakes were high, and each encounter felt like stepping deeper into the lion's den. One of the first names on the list was a man named Victor, a former business associate of Daniel's father. He had been close to the Remington family for years, but after the accident, he had distanced himself, eventually aligning with the very people who wanted to see Daniel disappear. Victor was now a powerful player in the shadowy world that surrounded Daniel's inheritance, and getting to him was not going to be easy. Lily could see the tension in Daniel's face as they approached the high-rise building where Victor's office was located. "Are you sure about this?" she asked quietly, sensing his unease. Daniel nodded, though his expression was grim. "We need to know what he's hiding," he said. "He's one of the few people who knows the full extent of what's happening." Lily's heart raced as they entered the building, the polished floors and gleaming windows a stark contrast to the dark world they were navigating. They had managed to secure a meeting with Victor under the guise of discussing a business opportunity, but the truth was far more dangerous. As they rode the elevator to the top floor, Lily felt her palms grow sweaty. This wasn't just about gathering information. This was a direct confrontation with someone who held the key to everything. When they entered Victor's office, he greeted them with a practiced smile, his eyes cold and calculating. He was a man who had seen everything and trusted no one. The tension in the room was palpable as they sat across from him, trying to play it cool. "It's been a long time, Daniel," Victor said smoothly, his gaze flickering over to Lily for a brief moment before returning to Daniel. "I didn't expect to see you again." Daniel forced a smile, though Lily could see the strain behind it. "I've been busy," he said evenly. "But I think it's time we talked about the past and the future." The conversation that followed was a careful dance, each word chosen with precision as Daniel probed for information. Victor was guarded, but Lily could sense there was something he wasn't saying, something he was hiding. She watched him closely, her mind racing with questions. What did he know about the people hunting Daniel? And how deep was he involved in their schemes? After what felt like an eternity, Victor's mask slipped, if only for a moment. "You're in over your head, Daniel," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "This isn't just about money anymore. It's about power, control, and survival. If you're smart, you'll disappear before it's too late." As they left Victor's office, Lily felt a cold dread settle in her chest. They hadn't gotten all the answers they were looking for, But one thing was clear. They were up against forces far more dangerous than they had imagined. "What now?" she asked as they stepped out into the street. Daniel's face was set in determination. "We keep pushing," he said. "We're closer than ever to the truth." The next few days were a whirlwind of activity. Thomas had warned them that time was running out, and they needed to act quickly. With each piece of information they uncovered, the picture became clearer. The people who wanted Daniel gone were deeply entrenched in the Remington family's legacy, and they weren't going to stop until they had taken everything. Lily could see the toll it was taking on Daniel. He barely slept, his mind constantly racing as they moved closer to uncovering the full extent of the conspiracy. But despite the exhaustion and fear, there was a fire in his eyes that hadn't been there before. He was ready to fight. The next move was the most dangerous yet. Thomas had found a lead on the man who was pulling the strings, a shadowy figure named Marcus, who had been orchestrating the downfall of the Remington family from behind the scenes. He was the one who had sent the man who had threatened Lily and Daniel in the alley, the one who had been quietly dismantling everything the Remingtons had built. To stop him, they needed proof, solid evidence that would expose him and his network. And that meant confronting Marcus directly. It was late at night when they arrived at the location Thomas had given them, an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of the city. The air was thick with tension as they made their way inside, their footsteps echoing in the empty space. Lily's heart pounded in her chest, and she could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her. This was it, the final move that would decide everything. They couldn't afford to fail. As they entered the warehouse, they saw Marcus standing in the center of the room, waiting for them. He was tall, his face shadowed in the dim light, but there was no mistaking the power he radiated. "You're a fool for coming here," Marcus said, his voice calm and cold. "You think you can stop me?" Daniel stepped forward, his face set in defiance. "I'm done running," he said firmly. "You're not going to take what's mine." Marcus smiled, a cruel, calculating smile. "You've already lost," he said. "Everything your family built is mine now. You're just a relic of the past." But before Marcus could say more, Thomas emerged from the shadows, holding a phone in his hand. "Not anymore," Thomas said, his voice steady. "We've recorded everything. It's over, Marcus." For the first time, Marcus's confident facade cracked. His eyes darted between Daniel, Lily, and Thomas, realization dawning on him. "You think this will stop me?" he hissed. "You have no idea what you've just done." But as the police sirens wailed in the distance, Lily knew that they had won. The battle wasn't over yet, but for the first time, they had the upper hand. As Marcus was led away in handcuffs, Daniel turned to Lily, his eyes filled with a mixture of relief and exhaustion. "It's finally over," he whispered. "If you enjoyed this story and want to see more content like this, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. And now, you have a new video appearing on the screen, full of unexpected twists and heartwarming moments. Click and get ready for another inspiring story.